Distinguished guests, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Zhao Catalan. I'm the Monash Director for External Engagement and Events. Welcome to this special Monash Commission keynote panel discussion titled Monash and Melbourne in 2040, What Action Needs to be Taken Now to Secure Resilient Livability and Prosperity for Citizens and Wider Melbourne City Regions. I wish to begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands we are gathered today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd like to now invite the founder of the Monash Commission and President and Vice-Chancellor, Professor Margaret Gardner, to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I hope you can all hear me fine. I suspect I don't need the microphones, and it's lovely to see you all here. Let me particularly acknowledge the Monash Commission members, of whom more later. Councillor Tina Samaji, Mayor of the City of Monash, Dr Andi Diamond, Chief Executive Officer of the City of Monash, the Chief Executive Officers of other local councils, Jude Munro, who's Chair of the Victorian Planning Authority, Professors Sean Carney and John Funder, who are Vice-Chancellors Professorial Fellows, members of the Monash University Council, of whom we have, including our Deputy Chancellor, Simon Crean, in the room. I've got there, he's right in front of me, and I'm looking around, sort of scanning the room. Members of Monash leadership, of whom there are many in the room, and distinguished guests, one and all. I'm very pleased that you are all here. Let me also begin by acknowledging that we meet here on the unceded lands of the people of the Eastern Kulin Nations and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And let me also acknowledge any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us in the room today. This has been a long time coming, but really thrilling. The last time we were able to gather together a smaller and less international contingent, if you like, in terms of our location, about this was some many months ago when we launched this report, and a number of the Monash Commission members joined us online. And we were actually also in Collins Street, but down in another of the Monash buildings down on 750 Collins Street, which is, so for the non-Melbourne members, we are up here in what is known laughingly as the Paris end of Collins Street, and there was a reason for calling it that once. And the 750 is down absolutely the other end, so they bracket the city. So we've at least bracketed part of the central business district in dealing with this. So this is here because Monash is interested in many ways, not just in its research and in its education, in addressing complex human-centric challenges. And that means not just through research and education, but by engagement with others, with the people who are part of our community, and by lending whatever weight it can to advocacy and awareness. So the Monash Commission is a vehicle by which Monash is endeavouring to unpack complex issues, support policy solutions, not that are actually there developed by Monash for Monash, but in which we bring experts together and we ask those experts who are drawn from beyond Monash to help discuss and bring their expertise to bear on an important question. So the Monash Commission was established in 2018. It aims to lead a series of independent inquiries on priority issues and to be able to communicate the findings. And so it doesn't just communicate the findings in the final report, it actually also publishes the workings, because too much of what people see is the final report, particularly if you're dealing with government reports, and maybe not even then all of the final report. But in our case, we put all the constituent papers and discussions up for people to see, because people may wish to pursue it in different ways. The first topic of inquiry of the Monash Commission was the future of post-compulsory education in Australia. And that report was released now a few years ago. It preceded by some years the review that's currently underway of higher education in Australia, and I wish they'd been more proximate. But the reality is, in the review of higher education that's underway in Australia, that review and its panel members and people concerned with it have gone back to look at the final report and have gone back to access the papers and the workings that dealt with particular questions that informed the final report. So I think I can say to you with some confidence that that process of allowing people to see in total what is going in to producing a series of recommendations has been found valuable, at least by a group of people undertaking another government review on the first commission. And that report made 3 salient recommendations. I have some hopes that maybe at least 1 or 2 of them might find their way into the final recommendations that will shape higher education in Australia as a result of this current review. In a moment, Dr. Andi Diamond is going to speak to you on this second inquiry, which we're here to talk about, the livable metropolis, the opportunity of intermediary cities to deliver resilience, impact and prosperity. And I want to just provide not very much context beyond what I've just provided, because many of you were here either online or in person when we launched it last year. But what happens with each commission is we invite a new panel of Monash commissioners. We think about the topic, we look out, we say who might provide interesting engagement. We reach out then as well into the university community and say what expertise will they bring to bear, and assemble them and get them to provide input, therefore drawing our expertise into the process. But what we came together to discuss here is a very complex problem. And all of you who are more intimately associated with either the research on or the development of the input into cities than I am, know that they are indeed complex beasts and worthy of continuing discussion. And there is hardly ever a time when there isn't a debate about the future of cities or some aspect of them. But what was interesting about this report and the experts brought together is that the questions pre-COVID were the things that people have been grappling with for some time with large cities. Population growth, urban sprawl, how you make a city livable. And in fact, to suggest that really you might move out of the centre of a city, that you might reverse the process of urbanisation in some way that we've been seeing inexorably over most of the human history that we've been part of, and much of it before our time, seemed an odd thing to do. And to question the role of intermediary cities or cities within cities, particularly in Australia, where we were constantly talking about the advantages of densification, seemed odd. But of course we hit a pandemic, and as the pandemic progressed, we witnessed a series of behaviour that seemed to show people, and frankly, you could have come in here and fired a gun down Collins Street and be lucky to hit anybody, and you could be sure that every single coffee shop within many, many hundreds of metres radius didn't exist and had no one in it. They weren't even serving coffee out of a little window to anybody because no one was here. And nobody believed that would happen. All of a sudden, the whole context was different. So it turned out that the group that was brought together to talk about this important question, because it goes to how we have livable cities, found themselves undertaking that in the midst of a time when the whole population could be seized of how different the world could look, how different cities could look. What happens when this thing that we see as the hub and the centre, these tall buildings, sort of strange little amenities scattered around the bottom, not enough trees, what happens? What happens when they become no longer so important. I thought it was just an amazing time. So the report that's put forward by the Monash Commissioners offers a different perspective on small to medium-sized cities. It brings forward, I think, a number of really interesting case studies to demonstrate that there are entirely different ways and attributes of vibrant and self-sustaining communities, that cities might be small and beautiful, that cities might be dispersed in different ways, that there might be different ways that people live and work in them. So the Commission started to think about the effect intermediary cities can have on the entire metropolis and how they make a difference to the livability and resilience of communities. And they weren't things that people might be thinking about for the future, they were things people were actually living through, and that happened to be a very fortunate timing, I think. Now is the time, we think, for all stakeholders, all those people who are engaged in the lives of cities, governments at all levels, institutions such as universities and others that provide particular anchors to types of activity, that they look at their relevance and this report in terms of metropolitan ecosystems and how we can work together to find more livable outcomes for entire communities. So I was really pleased yesterday to encounter the Monash Commissioners on our Clayton campus, which of course when it was established was, well, it was known to the students who went there. It took its first students in '61 as the farm. And it was known as the farm because it was a farm before the university was there. And you think of Clayton now, which is basically sitting in the population centre of Melbourne City, and you say, oh, in our alumni's lifetime, the world looks entirely different. Surely we must be able to think about things differently. And so I was pleased to see them on the Clayton campus, and we weren't a dusty farm, I hope, as they found. And Melbourne was doing that thing when it does in autumn, when it pretends it's always like this, blue skies, you know, light zephyr of a breeze, you know, the waving trees, the sort of glorious temperature, and lures people into thinking it's like that all the time. And those of us who live here like to remember that it's like that some of the time. The panel session today, Imagining Functional Cities, Intermediary Cities in 2040, is looking at the action that needs to be taken. We're examining a series of questions, as you know. What are the challenges to achieving this future? What do the examples around the world tell us about dealing with those challenges? What do we think is best emerging practice, or what could we conceive of as best emerging practice? And what are the key actions that we should think about pressing for now, organisationally, local, state, federal government? So I'm going to hand over to other more expert people to talk about that, but before I hand over to Dr. Diamond, I want to particularly acknowledge the efforts of the commissioners who I've mentioned but not by name, delivering this important piece of work. Dr. Mark Birrell was the chair, Gabrielle Trainer, Julie Wagner, Professor Jinhua Zhao, Professor Emeritus Kays Castellans, Professor Chris Olds, Professor Ting Chai Koo. And in particular, we're happy to have him back, Professor Ken Sloan, who once was ours and is now the Vice-Chancellor of Harper Adams University, who helped instigate and then coordinate this opportunity and this inquiry and this group of commissioners, even though he went from the wilds of Clayton to the apparently milder climes of Shropshire. But they look considerably more like a farm than Monash does, yes. So let me introduce Dr. Andi Diamond. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Commission members. Andi Diamond's the moderator, but of course she brings all her own experience. As you know, she's the Chief Executive Officer for the City of Monash, which is where our home campus is located, current board member of Good Shepherd Australia, New Zealand, and chair of the Victoria University Business School Industry Advisory Board. Started her career as a social worker. Has worked in, the hard areas of social work, being part of the Victoria's first sexual assault team. trained both in child protection, trained both child protection and Victoria Police. Career in local government has taken across a series of councils, Boroondara, Shire of Melton and Monash. I guess you're getting sort of closer to the, sort of moving towards the CBD, I guess. Andi holds a Bachelor of Arts in Social Work from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and a Master of Business Administration, Doctorate of Business from Victoria University. She's also, of course, a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Please welcome Dr. Andi Diamond.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. I too would like to begin by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples and traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waterways on which we live. We honour and pay our respects to elders past and present. Welcome, everyone. The Monash Commission released The Livable Metropolis in July 2022, at a time where we were still grappling with the impacts of a global pandemic. The report fundamentally challenges the heightened and central role given to the CBD for future planning and recognises the need for greater balance between the CBD and surrounding cities. Music to my ears. The report calls out the increasingly important role played by non-CBD cities or non-primary cities in creating polycentric networks. It promotes intermediary cities as core to successful city planning. It also acknowledges the role of intermediary cities in creating genuine regional connection, making for the balance between CBD and surrounding municipalities much more even, and a recognition that it's collaboration that rather than competition that should set the agenda. It lays bare some of our challenges, including the rising cost of living, social and housing inequity, environmental quality, traffic congestion, and calls for a different way of planning. And whilst we have long recognised that it's coordinated efforts that make our cities more livable, that address inequity, we have struggled to do just this. Let me call out some of the realities of a suburban municipality. Yes, the City of Monash. We're home to more than 200,000 residents. Outside of the CBD, it's Monash where most people come to work each day. It's easier to get public transport from our activity centres into the CBD than it is to move around our municipality or to travel southeast where many of our residents work. Equally as difficult to get to our national employment cluster other than by car. We are very car-centric. Housing prices relatively unaffordable, and a changing community whose needs are varied and different, far from the 20-minute neighbourhood, ageing population but stable birth rates, and the return of families into the municipality, as we are home to some of the very best public schools, strongly and proudly multicultural, a community that now requires a broader housing stock range. The brick veneer home replaced by apartments in and around our major activity centres. 24-storey development in Glen Waverley. Who would have thought some 20 years ago? Monash is home to many significant institutions, and just to name a couple, clearly Monash University, Monash Health, Synchrotron, CSIRO, some of the large corporates also call Monash home. Prior to COVID, we witnessed increasing social and economic stress, couch surfing, illegal rooming houses popping up, and more people sleeping rough. Not only in Monash, but a problem experienced right across the southeast, and this is intensified through the pandemic and still continues. Disappointingly, services were and still are centred around inner metropolitan Melbourne. But what we've learned on the ground is that it's not unusual for people in crisis to return to their place of origin, the place they grew up in, and they do come home, and we don't have services to offer them. And COVID has only added to that complexity. The recognition of the intermediary city, its role in gaining connection, networks and localised solutions is evidenced by the many case studies in the report. And what we see is the opportunity to measure success more broadly, not just economically, but to focus on social, educational, cultural outcomes and to be citizen-centric. This report for me and its findings and recommendations is a call to action. Can we do it? Let's find out from our commissioners. Commissioners, I'll invite you up, please. Welcome. Make yourselves comfortable. And now it's my great pleasure to give you a little bit of history on each of our commissioners. Professor Emeritus Kees Christiaans is a world-renowned architect and urban planner, and is the founding partner of KCAP Architects and Planners, with offices in Rotterdam, Zurich, Shanghai. He has held various teaching leadership positions with institutions such as the Technical University of Berlin, ETH Zurich, Singapore University of Technology and Design, and the Technical University of Munich. Professor Christiaan's work focuses on urban assignments in complex situations and on guiding urban processes. He's an expert in the development of university campuses and in the revitalization of former industrial, railway and harbour areas, and is a supervisor of several international urban developments. Please welcome Kees.
Thank you very much.
Professor Chris Olds is a professor in the Department of Geography, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Olds has worked as an academic in the UK, US, Canada, Singapore, Paris, and China. Let me tell you how that challenges my worldview. I only think in terms of municipal boundaries. Professor Olds' current research focuses on the globalization of higher education and research, as well as infrastructure, platforms, and cities. This research agenda relates to his long-standing research interest in the globalization of the services industry and their relationship to urban and regional change. Please welcome Chris. Welcome. Gabrielle Trainer comes from much closer to home. She's a non-executive director whose experience spans over 25 years on boards in the public and private sectors, including currently as the chair of the Construction Industry Culture Task Force, interim chair at Infrastructure Australia, board member of the Western Parkland City Authority, the Major Transport Infrastructure Authority, as well as commissioner for the AFL. And that certainly has been of much interest to the other commissioners. Gabby's career has been characterised by interest in creating quality of life through arts and culture, the public realm, design, sustainability and community engagement. Welcome, Gabby. Professor Ken Sloan is the Vice-Chancellor and CEO of Harper Adams University in the UK, a leading university in agri-food and champion for agriculture, agribusiness, animal health, welfare, land management, food innovation, and digital farming. Is there anything you left out? He served previously as the inaugural Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Senior Vice President of Enterprise and Governance at Monash University. He's also the Registrar and Chief Operating Officer at the University of Warwick. Professor Sloan has chaired and served on the boards of a number of institutional subsidiary companies, boards and international fundraising and development trusts. Great to have you back, Ken. Julie Wagner is president of the not-for-profit organisation, the Global Institute on Innovation Districts, GIID, which conducts novel research on the unique attributes and assets of innovation districts, to better understand how they can become a multiplier for growth for cities and regions worldwide. It includes a global network of 24 districts, which include the Monash Technology Precinct. Julie continues to serve as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and is a visiting scholar for the Isade Business School Centre for Global Economy and Geopolitics. A trained city planner from MIT, Julia served as Deputy Planning Director for Washington, D.C., where she managed the development of plans to aid that city undergoing significant economic and social transformation. As a prolific urban researcher, Julie has for the past 25 years helped advance the competitiveness of cities and urban areas and regions globally. Welcome, Professor Zhao is the director of the MIT Mobility Initiative, and Edward and Joyce Lindy, Associate Professor of City and Transportation Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He directs the Urban Mobility Lab at MIT and is the founder of the MIT Automated Mobility Policy Project. He's also the co-founder and chief scientist for TRAM, a mobility decarbonization venture. Professor Zhao's research focuses on bringing behaviour science and transportation technology together to shape travel behaviour, design mobility systems, and reform urban policies. He sees transportation as a language to describe a person, characterise a city, understand institutions, and enable cross-cultural learning between cities. Please join me in welcoming Zhao. Okay, are you ready, panel? Let's start with the most obvious question of all, and we'll start with Ken. Let's begin with hearing from you on what Intermediary Cities is and why the Commission saw this as important work. Thanks, Ken.
So I'm going to give a very simple answer to what turned out to be a very complex discussion in the Commission, because when we had a look at it, there were a whole raft of definitions of what an intermediary city is. So we had to decide on one. And what we landed on was, firstly, it's not a CBD, so it's not a large mega city. Secondly, it's a city of probably a population of less than 1 million. It could be lots of different variations on that. But perhaps most importantly, it's not an isolated entity. It's part of a network. It's connected to other things. It has a purpose for citizens that goes beyond itself and the people who are in that particular thing. Why did we think it was important? I think Margaret talked about it earlier. We have to go back to the context when we started the debate. Prior to COVID, the reason why we were looking at this was because there was a sense of frustration, whether it was in, as Andi expressed before, with Monash as a city, or even us when we were looking at Clayton and the precinct around Clayton, how to get a fair amount of consideration across Greater South East Melbourne and around places like Clayton and Monash in terms of the development of the state and priority in the state. And there was a feeling that this very centric model around the CBD and the City of Melbourne was just simply not sharing either the benefits or the potential of all of the different parts around the state. But then COVID hit, and what became clear was that citizens voted with their feet. Not just, so the government made the rules change so people had to stay locally, and they depended on locations which were not getting the attention of other places. So it became a very timely issue, and I think the overall conclusion we came to was if you want to get the best out of the whole geography and everything that's in it, you have to make all of it work. You can't just have one central hub in the middle and then just hope it ripples out to the rest.
Thanks for that, Ken. So if you take a little bit further, how is this then different to Victorian Local Government, where there's 79 councils, a mix of metro, regional, and with a very clear CBD? So
I think, again, we had this discussion, and we obviously had this discussion with Greater South East Melbourne this morning as well. If you were to go to a citizen in Victoria and ask them what the CBD is for, and ask them what they can do in the CBD, they would probably have an answer to that. They'd be able to tell you about the City of Melbourne and what it's got and what the attributes are. If you were to ask anyone about what happens in all of the other places and what the talent and potential and resources are in those places, unless they were talking about their immediate locality, then it would be quite hard for them to express that. So I think when we've talked about intermediary cities, we're talking about things that actually have identity, they have purpose, and that's a shared understanding, and then it's passed around. But as we've shown in the report through some of the case studies, there's a certain scale you have to get to deal with some of the existential challenges that we're facing. So if you're looking at climate change, if you're looking at transition to new models of work, the skills of the future, if you're looking at integrated sustainable transport, you're not going to be able to deal with those at that micro level of each individual local government. And in Greater South East Melbourne, you've recognised that. You've realised that you cannot operate as individual councils. You have to come together in order to be able to do that. So I think we would argue it is very different. It's purposeful, it's intentional, and it has the citizen at the heart.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to go to Kays. Kays, What needs to change, and what are the conditions to create a polycentric environment reflective of the intermediary city framework?
Yes, thank you. I have to start with to say that I am an architect who developed himself into an urban designer. And an urban designer is not an architect and it's not a planner. I detected that there is a gap between architecture and planning. Most of the time architects do not really understand what urban design is, and planners do not really understand what urban design is. So I concentrated to teach and research on this topic of urban design, and I geared the teaching and the research towards implementation, practical work, not towards too much theory, because there are not enough urban designers which are capable to really do the job in the world. So we created in that sense a certain amount of research units and teaching units that teach the practical quality of urban design. So I fly in from the perspective of a designer. If you want to make this city, which is a kind of stick with a pancake around it, into a more polycentrical landscape, which is eventually a more sustainable urban condition, definitely, then you have to do some things. So the first one is maybe a little bit provocative for Australia. You have to limit as much as possible greenfield development and stimulate as much as possible brownfield redevelopment. And if you do greenfield development, then you should develop a mechanism of compensation that you create within former developed country land. You develop new sustainable green area. The second thing is that if you start a process of implementation of urban design vision, you should not work on one scale at the same time. You should also not work within a design group isolated. You should work what we call simultaneous chess. You should develop a parallel set of work streams that are pushed forward at the same time, and therefore they create associations and disruptions and accelerate the process of implementation, and at the same time you also communicate what you are doing. Then you have to identify potential centralities for a polycentric transition. It means the needs of where potential mixed-use concentrations at transport crossroads with an overarching service function for the surroundings are possible. So you have to identify where there should be new centralities, and they are not, this is not rocket science. Most of the time you find them where there are crossroads, where there is a concentration of already concentrated functions, where there has been a village, etc., where there's a place. It's very important to look at these in a network concept. So you should not look at Melbourne in terms of CBD and Monash as a kind of standalone relationship, of a dialectic relationship. You should look at a network of the whole area and which position the different nodes are taking into that network. Because if you look at polycentric agglomerations worldwide, you see that the nodes do not compete. The nodes most of the time have distinct characters and distinct functionalities, and therefore are complementary. And this is the way that this should be developed. It's very important that a large urban agglomeration consists of nodes of different character and identities and of different programmatic and functional focus. Can be a knowledge center, can be an industrial center, can be a waterfront or beach town, or a cultural hub. The third thing is to create conditions to accelerate the centrality to grow and to intensify. So I mentioned a couple of them from the perspective of the designer. One is define boundaries, define the zone of influence in which it is important to settle your centrality. The second thing is create urban design guidelines and typologies that allow for densification, not necessarily initially to house certain programs, more like a programless approach in which you devise urban typologies that allow for densifications. The next one is foster a fine meshed street pattern for active street fronts, for walk and biking, and to create inside and outsides in blocks, which fosters semi-public or semi-private activity, which is extremely important for innovation and small-scale urban and social development. Then, of course, which my neighbor will focus on, develop high-level public transport. Do this in the form of a growth model, because there are many, very often there are enormous ambitions about the transport and they will not be met. So make a growth model in which incrementally your transport model grows in accordance with the critical mass. Then curate the allocation of key amenities and socio-cultural institutions. I think Julie will say something about that in a minute. How is work, life, edu, leisure in balance in such a future centrality? And then maybe the last point is adjust the government structure if needed, specifically in relation to the scale levels, to the authority, the hierarchy, and into a relationship with citizen engagement. So maybe that's a kind of small toolbox to start with to arrive at a more polycentric condition for this agglomeration.
It's a great start. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Jinhua to bring this to life. I mean, we've heard from Kees, we've got some of the theory. I'm going to take you back to the municipality that I truly love, City of Monash. You've travelled around it a bit. Large population, significant facilities and services. As I've said, the place where most people outside of the CBD come to work. Can we become a candidate to be an IC?
Yeah, so can Monash be a candidate for Intermediary City? We already are, right? The question is how do we make it even better, right? Both locally in the sense of improving the city within this network, but also internationally. How do we bring the successful story of Monash to the outside world? There are thousands of cities in the world struggling with a similar question there, right? The cities developing in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, they're looking for models, right? In a way, Monash deserves to be better known, right? So that's one function I hope the Commission can do, not only bring knowledge to Monash, but also bring knowledge back to the outside world, right? Let me share with you guys two ideas that were not written in the report. I just developed in the past 2 days motivation, right? The first thought is a little bit dangerous off script, but the first thought is risk allocation in the society. What do I mean by different parties in the society have a different risk tolerance, right? Yeah. The government has the lowest tolerance. I mean, the primary job of the government is to be stable, maintain stability, right? Industry have a higher level of tolerance of risk, right? But still have a bottom line to card. But academia, in theory, we should have a highest tolerance risk. In many ways, we are professors. We are paid to fail, right? So that others do not need to. What's unique about the city of Monash is we have all three combined in a unique way in this locality there, right? With a variety of things, we can optimize this risk allocation there. So I mentioned this point of experimentation. As an intermediate city, it's much more feasible for you to conduct meaningful experiment in a controlled way. And if it's successful, you scale up. If it fails, that's okay. You can fail gracefully. That's very, very important. If you're a metropolitan area, if you are like Tokyo or Sydney, you cannot. If you take something to wrong, 20 million people get hurt, right? Here, that's one thing I really want to emphasize as the unique feature being a IC here, right? The second one also mentioned that Monash being a university town, what was special about that, right? I do want to mention about the mentality of a student. Right? If a new student comes to the university, ask, what do you do here? Right? Let me say, I come here to learn. Right? Let me tell you, on the first day at MIT, when students come here, we orientate them. We say, you are here to learn, but more importantly, you are here to create. Right? From day one, we tell you're a student, that's right, but you are also a researcher. You're also an entrepreneur. You come here to innovate and to contribute. That's, I think, if we can bring this energy from the very beginning, that will make the Monash, both the city and the university, much more lively. And students are the one bring things together here, right? And also to make this part of the norm here. For example, again, in MIT, we kind of talk with the undergrad student. By the time they graduate, almost everyone have a startup, right? It's nothing special. It's just everybody does it. It's just followed, right? Can we create that type of norm to really innovate and the student become the connector between Moderna, between the city, between the university? I think that will make this IC really, really energetic on that.
Thank you very much. I need to sit down after that. I think there are a whole lot of challenges in there. Gabby, I'm going to come to you. To be effective, ICs need complementary partnerships across all tiers of government. What is the model you see as working in Australia, and particularly for us locally? We got very excited about city deals. They're costly and clearly not available to us. What would you suggest?
Well, I can talk a little about, I can talk a little about the Western Parkland City Authority, of which I'm a part, which is a part of the Western Sydney City Deal. The history of city deals is relatively new in Australia, as most of you will know. I think Malcolm Turnbull, when he proposed the first one in 2016, was probably influenced by his good lady wife, Lucy, who at that time was the chair of a body in New South Wales called the Greater Sydney Commission. And the Greater Sydney Commission had a vision for actually mapping out intermediary cities in New South Wales, in Sydney, Greater Sydney. And so they mapped out a policy and planning framework which had the Harbour City, the Parramatta City called the River City, and the Parkland City, which is 40 kilometres or so away from the centre. And I think Malcolm was influenced by that when he thought about the Western Sydney deal, which wasn't the first one, but probably the biggest, $11 billion over about 30 years, I think the investment is, including 120 million of community facilities. So this collaboration was, of course, federal, state and local government. 8 local government councils are a part of this city deal, but it has a few unique characteristics which I think have made it not entirely successful. It's still a journey, but has guaranteed some real progress. And that is a few structural issues. Not only is there the enormous benefit of having an airport under construction in Western Sydney, which is an enormous focus and a catalyst for growth, but structurally a body called the Western Parkland City Authority was formed, a collaboration between the federal and the state government. The board members are selected by both governments. And that organisation, our authority, was given the authority to coordinate the city deal, among other things. And so it could drive and have a voice for the 8 councils that were involved and really encourage collaborative competition, I'll put it that way. The 8 councils, of course, all want their council area to be the most successful, to attract the most investment, have the best quality of life and all the best amenity and facilities ever. But what the authority has been able to do, and a great credit to the councils, is really try and identify with each of them what they want to be famous for and how they can be part of the city deal. What sort of infrastructure, social and cultural particularly, that can help them achieve their aspirations. So I think structurally that has been a very important part of what has so far been a successful city deal. Now the federal government that we now have in Canberra, I think will undergo some sort of review and evolution, if you like, of city deals. There have been a few criticisms of them. You're quite right, Andy, that they are expensive. They've been competitive. There've only been 9 of them. And I think the model that will probably evolve is much more a partnership model, still involving the 3 tiers of government, but much more place-based and jobs-based, And I wouldn't be surprised if the new National Reconstruction Authority, with its $15 billion worth of potential investment in creating new industries and better sovereign capability for Australia, I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes a component of decision-making around these new city partnerships. So there will be different models, there will be different structures that are evolving, but I think the spirit of collaboration and the spirit of generosity and the spirit of seeing that if Greater Western Sydney prospers, the rest of Sydney prospers, the rest of New South Wales prospers, and Australia prospers. And I think that the same applies to the councils in the Greater South East with whom we met this morning. The same potential exists, but I think the structure of the Western Parkland City Authority as part of the deal has been a major ingredient in assisting with that. I could talk for a long time about it, but I'll stop now and pass on back to
Thanks, Gabby. Julie, this one's for you. I mean, there's a strong theme of livability in the Commission's work, a move from the quantitative to qualitative. What's worked elsewhere? And if you could share some of the models that you've seen globally, that would be great.
With respect to innovation districts.
Yeah.
So we started this research on innovation districts and an evolving geography of innovation emerging in cities and regions around the world. I think Australia has been really working with this model for quite some time. Additional research over the last 4 years has really added an important and a distinctive flavor for the catalytic role that innovation districts can play in the midst of an intermediary city concept. Additional analysis over the last 4 years helps clarify, and I can use the Monash Innovation Precinct as a perfect example, of very specific R&D strengths, biomedical at a high level, but then very specific disciplines, highly translational, highly applied, and very sticky to industry, that are driving new insight to move very specific disciplines and problem-solving capabilities to an entirely new level. You have embedded already within your local fabric these particular geographies that have heightened enlightenment, if you will, in these particular areas. It's now about how these particular strengths then get connected to enforce the economy, to grow new talent into new jobs, and to have an opportunity to lift more boats. So that's a very horizontal set of acts and actions that require a new way of thinking and governing. But innovation districts, if I look at it within a intermediary city concept, and you can sort of look at it across the region, is sort of these stars of opportunity to drive your economy to new heights and bring your talent along with it if you have the right systems in place. This is the opportunity and the challenge for not just this region, but for all regions.
It's hard to follow on with another question after that, isn't it? Chris, thanks for being so patient. Can you talk to us a bit about citizen-led themes and what this looks like in relation to deliberate engagement and what we are already doing?
Sure. Test. Okay. So thank you. I'm going to, for both my responses, run through a few cautionary points, I think. My family and colleagues always criticize me for being endlessly optimistic. But I would like to reinforce a couple of lessons, and I think there's a couple of city regions, including Vancouver, where I'm originally from, where we can derive some lessons and think a little bit about what not to do or what to be aware of. So with respect to citizen-led themes, they were key to the content and the issues and recommendations in the report. And there's a couple of reasons, I think, why that's the case. So intermediary, if you haven't read the report, there's an interesting little snippet in there that they are significant with respect to regional, subnational, national, world, regional, and global settings and development processes. So intermediary cities, are 20% basically of the global population and 30% of the global urban population. So these are significant population spaces. They are often growing far more rapidly than city centres. And you'll find in, for example, the Vancouver metropolis that the power now rests in what we would deem the suburbs and the intermediary cities, much to the consternation of the city of Vancouver and the university that is located there at the far west point, the University of British Columbia, compared to Simon Fraser University, which was established at the same time as Monash. The report examines lots of different issues related to cultural and social themes, structural, governmental, spatial, environmental, societal, and behavioral. And I think they remind us that intermediary cities and their relational partners need to be shaped and harnessed and governed to work for firms, peoples, communities that are in place. And so when, for good, there are intermediary cities and the kinds of spaces that Monash are located in become objects of study, objects of development, then sometimes these developmental agendas can actually generate a whole series of ripple effects and implications for people who live there, not always positive. Right? They can lead to displacement, to transformations and disruptions, including, for example, if you build new infrastructure systems for firms, for retail outlets, for family firms, and these sorts of things. So I think one of the key points that you see with respect to this is thinking about people in place prosperity, and this is in part why we also looked at issues around livability indexes and thinking about different ways to think about livability. Because if you don't think about livability for the people, you always have to ask the question, livability for whom? And I would flag as well the intergenerational dimension of this. So the equivalent spaces within Metro Vancouver have become basically unlivable for younger generations. You complain about, for good reason, housing prices here in places like Vancouver, the second most expensive city after Hong Kong on a per capita basis to income. And so the ripple effects have generated huge intergenerational schisms, and these are kinds of things you need to think about. So lots of positive things going on in places and regions like Vancouver, and I see echoes of this here, but 1 or 2 steps forward and 3 or 4 steps backwards, especially for certain segments of society, is a challenge and an issue. And so that's why I think it's important to think about, again, not just GDP and economic development and so on, but also thinking about populations, the people in place prosperities.
Thank you for that answer. Gabby, can you talk about some of the key measures? How do you know when a city is truly humming?
I think intuitively we all know when a city's humming. We look around, it's beautiful, it's optimistic, it's generous, it's inclusive. And there have been many, many attempts, we could do a 2-day workshop on this, to describe livability in cities. The Economist Economic Intelligence Unit is a famous one. You'll see in our report that we've redone a few of their metrics in line with what we've discovered about intermediary cities and quality of life. But the UN, for instance, has its happiness index, and one of the indices is generosity, which I always really like about that. But the one that appeals to me most in an Australian context, and this is partly because it has been derived from the citizens themselves, and it really comes from what could be described as an intermediary city, Canberra. It's a population of about 500,000, a bit less, and has the advantage of its size in having real engagement with its citizens. But the ACT government has, over the past few years, I think they started in about 2019, developed what they call the Wellbeing Index. And they have actually produced a wellbeing budget based on the Wellbeing Index. And government decision-making, no matter what area of policy, has to now consider the Wellbeing Index. And I won't describe it in detail, you'll find it in the report, but there are 12 interlocking factors that make wellbeing, and within those the ACT government is in the process of developing a whole raft of metrics. Many are qualitative, many are quantitative, to cover areas like safety, access and connectivity, governance, citizen participation, time for life. There are 12 very different domains. And so they're busily collecting statistics and quantitative data, and they're populating these 12 domains. But even better than that, they are now looking beyond averages. They are looking specifically in a cross-sectional way to how disadvantaged groups or minority groups relate to quality of life, because you can get a very good average figure, but if you're a person with a disability, or you're gender diverse, or you're elderly, or you're very young, the average is not going to be all that meaningful. So, to the ACT government's great credit, they're building in this beyond averages perspective to the wellbeing index. So, I think the message is people centricity. Cities are no longer, whether you're an intermediary city or a large city, no longer just seen as economic units, thank goodness, or places where buildings go up and people commute to jobs. Of course, economic prosperity and social prosperity are and quality of life are at the bottom line. But I think this area of actually looking through the people lens at the experience of living in a city and tracking and measuring that and making decisions as governments in accordance with that sort of framework. Not that one's perfect, but it's a really good Australian model, I think. I think that's a really good trend that we should all be looking at, and I'm sure other intermediary cities will adopt similar metrics.
Thank you very much. I've still got a number of questions, but I'm going to put those to a side. I have no doubt that you've got questions of your own. So with your permission, Commissioners, I'm actually going to open it up to the floor. Jude, if I ask you to...
I'll start the batting. Jude Munro, Chair of the Victorian Planning Authority. I'd like to perhaps start with congratulating Monash Uni and the Commissioners for your work. It's very impressive and really, I think, fills a vacuum. Victoria, I think it'd be fair to say, in relation to the whole of Victoria, probably supports the polycentric approach, and indeed within metropolitan Melbourne. It has named 3 national employment innovation clusters. In fact, the Monash one goes broader than the City of Monash and involves 3 municipalities in total. Our governance model of local government doesn't entirely match what may emerge as the new polycentric model for Melbourne. The Victorian Government has a policy of 70-30, so 70% future growth should be happening in established Melbourne and 30% in greenfields. So the notion of restricting greenfields development is very much a policy intent, but it's been a case in Ngāti Tung's terms of let 1,000 flowers bloom as opposed to real control and government direction around that. So less than 50% of local councils, unfortunately, have got plans around a polycentric city. They don't actually, NIMBYism, not in my backyard, hasn't supported densification in Melbourne. And I suppose one of the questions that I have for you as a panel is, how does a metropolitan area get together the voices that understand the position that you've articulated and start to build a coalition of support that will shift the public sentiment to move from NIMBYism into actually understanding the benefits of having an urban growth boundary, protecting the food bowls, creating those innovation districts which often flow around universities, and not ignoring the fact that there might be a central district, because there will be quaternary services. I'm on the board of the Royal Children's Hospital. That is a quaternary service, but it doesn't mean to say we don't support the work in, for instance, the Monash hospital system. How do we get the voices to articulate the need for the polycentric city to have governance that's stronger, but not in the face of building a community coalition of support for such a vision?
Who would like to start? Julie? Please.
Yeah, I was just mentioning, the example of Amsterdam. So Amsterdam is part of the Randstad, Holland, which Amsterdam is 1 million people. The direct vicinity is 2 million people, and the Randstad in total is 8 million people. And that consists of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, and the middle-sized cities in between. There was this problem in Amsterdam that the core city and the surrounding municipalities, even under the umbrella of the province, were not willing and were not able to come to a consensus about the urban development, and specifically also the development of central places. And so one of a more enlightened member of the town planning department in Amsterdam, you always need people with an initiative and a vision and an enormous bundle of energy. He decided we create a regional vision. So he abandoned the vision of the Randstad Holland as a kind of polycentric agglomeration, very large, and concentrated on the north wing of it, consisting of Amsterdam Metropolitan Area, AMA, how they call it, and started a communication process by building an enormous model, physical model, which was something like 5 by 5 meters of the region, and shipped it in a truck and visited thousands of addresses, from local residents to mayors and councils of the surrounding cities, to companies, to the directors of the airport, to I don't know what, and started to create a narrative. And the narrative was densified over time. It took something like, I guess, 2.5 years at least. And by the time there was a certain, let's say, story hovering in between the different parties. And eventually, to make a long story short, it became, under the umbrella of the province, a political covenant between the cities and their precincts. And it's very important that it's a political covenant, because it's not a legislative instrument, this future vision. It is, as soon as these plans turn into legislative documents, they are killing any innovation and any also willingness to comply. But as soon as you arrive to kind of plant these narratives in the heads of a large amount of the population, and you turn it into a political covenant, which is a kind of non-binding deal where people should comply by means of vision, then you have a chance of success. Yes.
Anyone
I
else
don't know.
want to make comment?
I'll just say a couple of quick thoughts. The first is good design. Unless you have apartment living with great amenity, access to public open space, really good acoustic design, cross-ventilation and amenity, people will naturally not want to live in apartments. That's one thing. So I think it's incumbent on planners and architects to make sure that that living in an apartment is a really good experience, and not like some of the things that we do see, unfortunately, around
I won't say Melbourne, but lots of other places. No, occasionally in Melbourne, all right. The second thing that occurs to me is demographics and economics. I mean, I think if you look at build to rent, which is becoming a much more prevalent housing option, build to rent, not affordable build to rent, but build to rent where there are young people, particularly, who are attracted to an environment where they can share facilities like gyms and have a concierge and have the mobility to close the door and go away for the weekend, where active transport is very available to them. I think young people are much more inclined to look at apartment living and look at the benefits of density than the traditional family and quarter acre block, which still exists in certainly some people's minds. But young people are having smaller families, if families at all. I think, city life is becoming much more interesting and attractive. Intermediary city life as well. Arts and cultural experience is much more important to people than it's ever been. I think, it is all about the quality of life that you can create in apartment living that will eventually make people realise that this is a good way to live, as they have in Europe for centuries, as we know.
Chris, thank you.
I've got an economic argument, but I'll save that for the drinks after. But I guess cities have always drawn in resources, right? Natural resources from vast hinterlands. And there's a great book about the development of Chicago called Nature's Metropolis, which led to wide-scale transformations of forests, for example, throughout the entire Midwest that fueled the development of Chicago. But in the era of global urbanization now, there is this process, what some people have been calling planetary urbanization, where basically the development of cities, including intermediary cities, extended metropoli, are really creating vast ecological transformations throughout the world, right? So you've got, for example, a colleague of mine who does work in Brazil who's looking at where all the leather comes from in the SUVs, including the Honda CR-V I just bought recently. And so there's an ethical sort of ecological argument now. It's harder to make that case sometimes to some politicians and to some members of the community, but we really have a responsibility in the kinds of spaces that we're talking about to basically think about our, again, obligations to ensure that the development process is as dense as possible through different mechanisms, but because we're leading and guiding and shaping an entire global scale transformation.
Thank you for that. I think we had one hand over there and perhaps another, and that will need to be the end of our questions, please.
I'm Shelley Penn, I'm an urbanist and architect and Monash University architect, and I want to extend that question with thanks to you, I agree, and actually just ask you to talk a little about the role of government and culture. And I guess what I'm interested in is the fabulous discussion, thank you so much, and for the research and all the underpinning stuff that's behind it. I think there's no lack of will and recognition that we need densification in this city, and I think the example of the 70-30 policy in Melbourne, that also exists in Canberra, and Gabby, you might have to talk about that, but those two cities are not a bad comparative for reasons Gabby's already said, which is size. But there's also a different culture in Canberra as a planned city, a particular populace, and there's an understanding of the need and, in fact, an enforcement to some extent of rules and requirements around planning, size and scale of buildings, streets, and what are precious streets and what are not, all the way down to design quality. That means that there's a different appetite and willingness, as well as a different quality in outcome. And I think I'm a bit defensive of the NIMBYs now because, in fact, there's been a lot of indiscriminate development, and I think there's a very good reason people tend to say no to it, which is a shame. And I think it means that we have to be really careful to get the quality on the ground in the architecture, but also in the streets and urban spaces. And I've come to the view that government actually needs to play a stronger hand, and I think we don't do that strongly enough in the city. So we're actually at a point where there's been a willingness to densify, and now there are people, and I'm probably one of them in the inner west of Melbourne, saying, not here, this is not right. I want the density, but I also want the quality, and I want my fellow citizens to embrace it. So I just wanted to, and I think it's partly cultural, but I think it's also partly about the role of government. So I'm kind of commenting, but I'm asking you to talk about what you think and what government can perhaps do better in our context or generally, or what's important about government's role to make this stuff happen.
Julie.
So here's an observation that several of us actually have made as we fly in or fly in again. You know, we see that there's the state government playing an assortment of roles, and we see this in New South Wales, and the configuration of roles has actually been changing and evolving here. And then we come to Melbourne, and we see the state, and we see the activity at the hyper-local scale, and we see the municipal scale. But what's really happening in that intermediary space? There seems to be a pretty terrific gap here, right? So the intermediary city concept is actually speaking to the gap of an intermediary form of governance and leadership. That is the call. This is the imperative that, frankly, is ripe for Melbourne. So what is your future going to be? I mean, this is my question. Scenario A, you sit back as to how you are now. It's easy. This is the easy answer. Scenario B is thinking about if we were to act in an intermediary function, what does that mean for our councils? What does that mean in how government realigns itself and thinks differently, and how we govern differently? So this is putting forth a very, very different message about a new time and a new imperative. And I don't believe you really have a choice, to be honest.
Wow. I think you had your hand up.
I'm Catherine Sunderman. I'm Vice President of Urban Design Forum and also Director at MGS Architects. And yeah, thank you everyone for this incredible piece of work. And I think one thing that is kind of building on the previous two questions is around that idea of perhaps defending the NIMBYs and saying what about the citizens and what they want. We've heard that government needs to play a bigger role. I know that one of your 6 themes is around citizen-led development, but I would love to hear some concrete suggestions about what that might mean for Clayton, what that might mean for Melbourne and Victoria, perhaps drawing on some international examples like Vancouver.
Thanks, Chris.
It's a big challenge, especially in a gateway city much like Melbourne, Vancouver, where you've got immigrants from all over the world now with very different language capacities and capabilities, with very, very different understandings of what the state, the power of the state, the power of government is, whether or not you trust, whether you feel you could even speak up, because they've been having to grapple with life in places where speaking up can get you into a lot of trouble. And so with respect to, for example, the planning profession, planning processes and governance, they've had to grapple with that, and they've had to do a variety of things from local area planning site offices through to running different kinds of charrettes and planning and design exercises in very different ways. They've been fortunate in having good demonstration models, positive successes of high quality design that sink in and actually align quite closely with, for example, a lot of immigrants are coming from very dense locations. Apartment life, high-rise life is just normal. It seems very strange to live in single-family houses in low-density settings. And so they've been trying to sort of grapple with that. But it's been a real challenge, and I would say the big issue, and there's a gut instinct reaction against a more technocratic top-down model, and sometimes that's required to, for example, represent and guide the development process so it benefits the majority of society. But
let me add a more kind of a personal, my own evolution, my own understanding, right? I lived half my life in China, half my life in the West so far, roughly, right? You can see this about this exact problem, such contrasting models, right? My hometown, Qingdao, is a seashore town. If you go to Paas or Qingdao Beer, that come from my town, it has 8 million people, right? Coordination of the issue doesn't exist because there's one single mayor, the party secretary, actually. It's not that totally dictated, but it had played a very effective role of coordinating and managing the whole thing, right? But when my father visited me in Boston, he was shocked that there were 130 cities in the metropolitan area. Nobody listened to each other. He actually asked, wow, what a miracle that the streets even connect to each other. You guys, how do you do these things, right? So I live in this polarized world. It's really two extremes, right? Until I visited Malmö, Sweden. It's a city there. I talked to there. They have about, I think I forget, 22 councils, just like that, right? They do not have an overall dictate power from the top, but the 22 councils somehow achieved a common consensus in their metropolitan plan, and each council voluntarily joined in that, right? So that can be done, right? Let me quote, there's an economist called Elinor Ostrom. He's been critiquing this binary view of the world, either the state-driven or market-driven. He found actually many common pool resources. There are more local ways of managing that brings the two together, right? That can be done there. One of them is a shared storytelling. That you need a leadership that can tell the story so that all the people buy into that vision here, right? Particularly, the horizon matters, or perspective matters. When you stand within the Melbourne metropolitan area, different cities are fighting each other, but coming from outside, I don't care if it's Monash or Melbourne, it's just one entity, right? Why you guys are fighting each other? Similarly, just like when talk about climate change, if you're someone from Asia, look at the world, oh, human species, what are you guys doing here, right? You only have the view when you stand outside. So I think if you can bring the perspective outward a little bit, that will help the discussion quite a bit.
Case will have the final word.
Yeah, maybe in addition, we talked about the government level, about citizen participation. We have a little bit an experience in Europe that in cities like Amsterdam, Berlin, Zurich, in the 70s, the participation was boosted, and the decentralization of governance in the cities was very strongly pursued. In which in every planning activity, citizen committees were 100% equal partners in the planning process. And that led to the fact that people who owned land had nothing to say about what there was going to be built on it, because the participants more or less massaged politics in order to kind of realize what they would think was good. And this, of course, got into a chaos in all these 3 cities. And consequently, it was in the 1980s when there was a more sober and more business-like approach again to a kind of balancing back to a more top-down situation. And after that, it leveled again out into a more participative conception, where nowadays it's not so that bodies of citizens have something to say in the planning process, but the governance levels are looking actively for community leaders, for mandated representatives from the population that are also supported by the population, that give them mandate to be represented in the planning participation process, in which they are then official partners, and give consequently feedback to their background communities. And this works actually quite well. And of course, this is organized in parallel with communication procedures, in which you create an information center, in which you lay out a large model for an area, and in which these people specifically are then your stewards who help bring the scheme through the procedures.
I'm going to unfortunately stop us there. The good news is you will have a chance to speak to our panel members over refreshments. Let me thank Monash University, the Commission, for this opportunity, and this has been truly thought-provoking. And mostly, let me extend my thanks to all of you. You've given generously of your time. I think you've set us challenges. You've told us to extend our horizons, expand our language, expand our consideration. And I think what I'm certainly hearing from some of the questions is a real desire to establish that coalition of support. Thank you all again.
Thank you.